So raise your hand if you like surprises. We had like 3 hands immediately go up. It was like the Republican debate. There were like 3 of them at first, and then they were like, yeah, I think so, maybe. How many of you don't like surprises? More definitive, you notice? Like the people who said don't like surprises, they're very clear that they don't like surprises. So maybe somebody who likes surprises, can you tell us what you like about surprises? Just one. You don't have to plan it. Okay? So there's something about not having to worry about, great. And how about somebody who doesn't like surprises? Why don't you like surprises? Yeah.
I like to be prepared.
Like to be prepared. Okay, and it's hard to be prepared for a surprise. Okay? I actually want to make the case that maybe there is a way to prepare for surprise. But I hear you. Certainly, we think of surprises as something that happens to us, right? We're acted upon, rather than something that we have agency in. I actually want to suggest that surprise has something very deep to do with memory. And this isn't just my claim. There's actually strong evidence from research that some of our clearest memories are for experiences that took us by surprise. So think about your own life, right? Your own memories. Are there things from your childhood or from earlier in your adulthood, if you're an adult, where you, they really stand out in your memory, right? Maybe it was the first time you saw the Grand Canyon and just the enormity of it, right? And the surprise of, oh my God, there's something that enormous that I can't even really conceptualize what it would be like to go down into that canyon. Or I remember, going to New York City for the first time and not really knowing what to expect, but just being kind of overwhelmed by the surprise of the place, even though I'd seen images of it in movies and on TV. Perhaps you have memories from your childhood that were not so good, right? Times that you were surprised, maybe, right? I won't ask for a show of hands, but I bet some of us have memories from Halloween, right? An occurrence that happened on Halloween that was really terrifying and stuck with us in our memory, right? I remember one time I think I was in kindergarten where I negotiated with my mother. I had this pair of corduroy pants that I really, really loved, and she kept telling me, Danny, you've outgrown these pants. But I was 5 years old, and I was determined to wear these pants that I loved, and so I got myself into the corduroy pants, and I went off to my kindergarten class, and I bent over to pick up my pencil, and the seat tore in the back, which was surprising to me, although not so surprising to my mother. And I learned my lesson, and believe me, I remember that very, very well. So there is some sort of linkage between surprise and memory, and Rashi draws this connection between the two, and he does it on the maftir that we read today. So I'll just remind us of that maftir, which we also read on Shabbat Zachor right before Purim. Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember what Amalek, that is the Amalekites, did to you baderech, on the way, b'tzeitchem mitzrayim, on your way out of Egypt. Asher korcha baderech, how he korcha, we'll come back to that word in a second, but how he, here it says, surprised you on the march. Vayzanefcha kol hanechashalim achareh, and sort of cut down all those who were stragglers at the rear. V'ata ayef yageh, and you were exceedingly tired. Velo yarei Elohim, and the Amalekites had no fear of God. Okay? So that's the passage that we read. And I've shared with you in the past a midrash that Rashi brings about this, where he says, Asher korcha baderech is actually related to the word kar, which means cold, and he equates this to a bath, a boiling bath, and some shlemiel comes along and jumps in the boiling bath, and even though he gets scalded himself, he lowers the temperature for people who come after. So what was dangerous about Amalek is that Amalek essentially makes possible terrible things to come in their wake. But that's what the rabbis would call a smachta, right? Like that's a nice connection, but the word is not actually related to the word kar. And Rashi says that. He says, Rashi does what's called a davar acher. He says, here's another opinion on this. But the first opinion he brings is he says it's lashon mikre, right? It is the language of chance, of occurrence. And Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra, who lives about a century before Rashi, he says that it's related to the word korot, right? So that it's something that occurs to us. It's when we're acted upon. It's happenstance, okay? In other words, it's related to a sense of surprise. We remember Amalek, not just because Amalek was like the worst of our enemies. There were a lot of really bad actors in Jewish history, right? Why the Amalekites over the Egyptians or over the Philistines or any number of ites, right? Hittites and Jebusites and other ites who sort of came along and made war with us, or we made war with them, right? What is it about the Amalekites that are so bad? And what I want to suggest to you is it's that Amalek caught us off guard. Right? Amalek surprised us. We were feeling good about ourselves. We're coming out of Egypt, having been rescued from hundreds of years of enslavement. God's got our back. The wind is at our backs, and along comes Amalek and makes war on us. And does it in kind of the worst possible way, which we won't go into now, but something about the loss of innocence, the surprise that comes with that, leads to this sense that we are meant to remember Amalek differently and maybe more profoundly than we remember some of our other enemies. Our fears are understandable, of course, because we cannot forget, we shouldn't forget, all of the real suffering that we've endured. And of course, our tradition sensitizes us to the suffering of others that we're also supposed to be mindful of. According to the Talmud, Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol teaches the Torah warns 36 times, some say 46 times, not to oppress the stranger. So our experience of trauma and suffering is not only about protecting the Jewish people from trauma and suffering, it's also about being mindful of how this occurs to other peoples. And since we were slaves in Egypt, we know what it's like to suffer, and therefore, as we teach every year at our Pesach Seders and other times, we need to be mindful of slavery and suffering and displacement and structural inequities and so on and so forth. So memory is a good thing because it heightens our sense of empathy. When our antennae are up, we're more likely to remain safe, right? We're more likely to keep our own loved ones safe, and we're also more likely to keep the stranger safe, those who are also worthy of our concern. But there's also a cost to memory, right? There's also a cost to the linkage between memory and surprise, which is why I think our Parsha is ambivalent about memory. So I read you 2 of the 3 verses from the Maftir. Here's the third one. Therefore, when the Lord your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, timched zecher Amalek mitachat hashamayim lo tishkach. You should blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So if you notice, there's a kind of contradiction built into the text, right? That one phrase, you should wipe out the memory, which means, I think, don't remember. And then it says, Dafka lo tishkach, do not forget, right? And the whole passage started with Zachor et asher asah lach Amalek, remember what Amalek did to you. So which is it? Are we supposed to blot out the memory, or are we supposed to remember Amalek? And of course the answer is yes. Right? Both of these. The contradiction is intentional. Memory helps. Memory also hurts. We know these days we hear a lot about trauma-informed care, right? About being attentive to the negative impacts of memory and how we sometimes can exacerbate trauma by reopening wounds when we don't sufficiently remember. But what is the Torah trying to say by offering these paradoxical instructions? I believe it's reminding us that memory or remembering makes us also less likely to be surprised. And on one hand, that's good if we're trying to avoid being taken advantage of. But also being surprised is an important part of life, isn't it? That's how we learn. That's how we grow. If we only expose ourselves to the things that we already know, that are already comfortable, that are already within our kind of set of expectations and experiences, do we ever actually become fuller human beings? Or do we just stay in this kind of static state, ossified in what we know and who we think we are? Learning, growing are exceedingly important for us as people. That happens because of a willingness to be surprised, to be exposed to that which we don't know. And that, I think, is exceedingly important in Elul as well. On one hand, we should remember all the mistakes that we've made, that others have made, point those out, learn from them, grow from them, don't forget. On the other hand, maybe we should forget a little bit more than we allow ourselves to do. Rabbi Cheryl Milgram, a colleague at Congregation Kol Ami in White Plains, New York, cited a psychiatrist, Dr. Dan Siegel, recently in a piece in reformjudaism.org. And this is what Dr. Siegel writes. This revelation is based on one of the most exciting scientific discoveries of the last 20 years. How we focus our attention shapes the structure of our brain. I had the privilege, actually, of learning with Dr. Siegel years ago, along with the late Congressman Elijah Cummings. Both were impactful on me in teaching about the power of empathy. And I remember during this class that I had with Dan Siegel, he taught about how to cultivate what he calls yes responses in our brain. That there are ways we can teach our children, for example, but also ourselves, to be more open to the gifts that the world has to offer, to take chances, to explore, and to be more curious and imaginative and less worried about making mistakes. In other words, to be less encumbered by our fears about today's Amalekites, whoever they may be, and more open to surprise. So I had an experience last week that reminded me of the possibilities of surprise. I went mountain biking. I'm a little hesitant to share this because I'm a little afraid I'm going to get this reputation as like, what does this guy Burg do all the time when he goes away? Like he learns to scuba dive, he goes mountain biking, does he ever learn Torah? But it was an amazing experience, and I do want to share this with you. So my family and I were in Quebec. We'd never been to the French-speaking part of Canada, so we went to Montreal and we went to Quebec City, and we spent Shabbat staying at a place about an hour north of Quebec. And the mountain biking was in this place called Le Massif de Charlevoix, which I always thought was pronounced Charlevoix, but it's not. The mountain was quite high, I don't remember, but like several thousand feet. And they had a gondola that goes up. It was a ski resort, so we were there in the off-season. It was a nice place to spend Shabbos. We didn't have to worry about meals. They had a lot of vegetarian options, which was not a given, by the way, in Quebec City. They're like, hey, would you like to try the rabbit? No. So that was good. And on Sunday, there was an opportunity to sign up for a mountain biking lesson. Now, I have to say, this was not on my bucket list. Right? This was not something, like scuba diving is something I'd always wanted to try. I was not somebody who said, I really need to like go mountain biking. When I see people ride bicycles down mountains, my immediate thought is those people are insane. Like, why would you want to take a bike and ride it down a mountain? So I didn't know anything about mountain biking, of course. So I was in a position where I was open completely to surprise. I really didn't know anything about it. And so I signed up for the lesson, and they had this small course at the base of the mountain near the resort where we were staying. And they gave us bikes, and they were sort of good bikes, and they taught us how the shocks work, and there's a button on the... Anyone ever been mountain biking? Okay, so people who do this, you sort of know that there's like a button on the handlebars that you push, and the seat will pop up, which is really helpful when you're pedaling uphill, and then you can kind of depress it, and the seat goes down, which is really helpful when you're going downhill because you really don't want the seat, sort of doing things while you're going downhill. So you learn sort of how to stand on the pedals, right, and how to sort of navigate on the course. So I learned this, and since I have some, decent biking skills, I've never been mountain biking, but I've been road biking, and, I grew up riding a BMX bike like every kid, I think, and so I like decently sufficient on a bike. After a while practicing on the course, they redivided us into different groups, and they said, you can go with the group that's going to take the gondola up the mountain, and there's another course at the top of the mountain where we can practice. So I thought, that's cool, right? We'll get on the gondola. We learn how to load our bikes onto the gondola. We go up the mountain. There's a kind of stopping point in the midpoint of the mountain. I think, oh, great, we're going to get off here. We're going to do a little thing. We keep going up to the very top of this ski mountain. And we get off, and we get our bikes off the gondola, and we ride them down to this course, which is more advanced than the course at the bottom. And, the views looking out over the St. Lawrence River are really extraordinary. And we're practicing going over these wooden platforms and around embankments and learning sort of how to stand and how to grip the bike and all of these things. And I think, wow, this is amazing. How cool that I got to experience mountain biking. And then at the end of this, they redivide us into two groups, and they say, okay, this group, you're going to go off that way. You're going to practice more on the course. This group, follow me. And the instructor takes our group sort of down a path, and we ride down, and he says, okay, this group, if you would like, we're going to go down the mountain. So I said, okay. Because for some reason I was like open to surprise, and all of this was completely new to me, and this guy seemed to know what he was doing, although I have to say the instructions were almost entirely in French. And I took like 2 years of high school French, so I knew like a few words here and there, but I really didn't understand. And the best part is he would speak for like 3 minutes in French, and then he'd say like 2 sentences in English to me, because I was the only one who didn't speak French, and all I could think of was like, what were the other 2 minutes and 50 seconds worth of instructions that I clearly did not receive. But I'm thinking, okay, you know what? I'm in a good place. I'm open to surprise. Let's try it. And I have to say, it was the most extraordinary experience. I fell in love with mountain biking. I didn't know to even consider the possibility of riding a bike on a mountain because I really didn't even understand what it was. I just thought, like crazy people, take bikes, point them downhill, and ride them. But no, like there are trails, and the trails are maintained, and there are wooden bridges, kind of like the ones that are in the course. And there were muddy patches, and we learned how to navigate the roots and the mud and how to use our brakes. One time I used one of my brakes too much, and I fell off the bike. And I wasn't the only one who fell off my bike, but I was okay. I got back on the bike, and I kept riding. And some parts were really steep, and some parts were less steep. And it was an extraordinary way to experience this beautiful natural setting where we were going from the top of the mountain where there were no deciduous trees, it was all conifers, all the way back down to the base where the gondola was. And by the end of this, I felt like I had discovered not only something about mountain biking, but perhaps something about myself. That I had the capacity not only to be surprised, but to accomplish something that I thought would have been impossible for me, because now I actually understood what it was and how my capabilities resonated with that particular challenge. So my friends, we're coming up on a new year. And I think it makes sense to be thinking about memory at this time of year. One of the names for Rosh Hashanah is Yom HaZikaron, right? It is literally the day of remembrance. And that makes a lot of sense. But I want to suggest also that the time leading up to Rosh Hashanah maybe should be a time of selective memory. Right? How do we cultivate our curiosity? How can we maintain and perhaps expand our openness to surprise? Every year we dip those apples in honey for a reason, right? Because we want to have a sweet new year. How might developing our yes brains help us to make 5784 not just a year of wisdom and safety, important as well, but also a time of sweetness and joy. Shabbat Shalom.